Good evening, everyone. Mino Dibikod. Good evening. Bonsoir. I'm Josh Human. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant, and I'm pleased and delighted to welcome you to this evening's program, In Conversation, Rashid Johnson and Eric Mack, with moderator Dr. David Moos, co-presented with Art on Valise and Scrap Metal Gallery. The Power Plant's fall 2019 season will open Friday evening. We commonly have programs featuring our exhibiting artists immediately before or following our opening because, of course, they're here to install. So looking ahead, we'll have programs featuring Hajra Wahid with guest curator Nabila Abdelnabi and editor-in-chief of Canadian Art, Jane Wilkinson, on Saturday, September 21st at 1 p.m. at Harbourfront Centre's Lakeside Terrace, and that is free for all. And then Vincent Meeson with Montreal-based historian and author David Austin on Sunday, September 22nd at 6 p.m. at a private location. So if you're interested, we're taking RSVPs and we may end up with a wait list. For information about other fall programs, which include a 2-day symposium called Arctic Amazon this Thursday and Friday, as well as Sunday scenes, student night, film screenings, and more, if you haven't already, please grab a copy of our fall 2019 program guide or visit thepowerplant.org. But focusing on this evening, we're of course delighted to hear from Rashid Johnson, who has been installing today and tomorrow anxious audience at the Power Plant. We thank presenting donors Allison and Jim Christodoulos, lead sponsor ProWinco, and numerous other supporters who have made this exhibition possible. Additionally, the Power Plant is fortunate recipient of funding from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Council. And lastly, we continue to thank BMO for supporting the Power Plant's all-year, all-free admission program. When we were early in the planning phases for fall of 2019 programs, Rui Amaral from Scrap Metal Gallery wrote me that courtesy of Art on Valise, they would have an installation by Eric Mack. And the two artists, Rashid and Eric, likely would have a lot to discuss. And we thought, well, how much livelier would it be with a skilled moderator, Dr. David Moos? So we thank Art on Valise and Scrap Metal Gallery for this collaboration. Now, briefly about our three speakers. Rashid Johnson, his works employ a wide range of media to explore themes of art history, individual and shared cultural identities, personal narratives, literature, philosophy, materiality, and critical history. After attending Columbia College and studying photography at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, his practice expanded quickly to include sculpture, painting, drawing, filmmaking, and installation. He incorporates diverse materials like CB radios, shea butter, record covers, gilded rocks, black soap, tropical plants, and more. And these are often associated with his childhood and refer to collective aspects of African American history and identity as he desires to transform and expand each material's field of association. Eric N. Mack refers to himself as a painter, but he extends and transforms painting as tactile assemblages, created with textiles, including worn clothes, moving blankets, and torn rags, along with printed images and typography from photographs, books, and magazines. He attended Maryland Institute College of Art, the Cooper Union, Yale University, Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and did a residency at the Studio Museum of Harlem. This year, he's enjoyed a solo exhibition titled Let Me Walk Across the Room at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. He's included in the Whitney Biennial, participated in Desert X in Rancho Mirage, California, and was a contributing artist to Grace Wales Bonner, A Time for New Dreams, at the Serpentine Gallery. And our moderator, Dr. David Moos, studied art history at McGill University in Montreal and Columbia University in New York. He has served as curator of modern and contemporary art at the Art Gallery of Ontario and Curator of Contemporary Art at the Birmingham Museum of Art, Alabama. With an esteemed record of publication, he is now an art advisor. So I'll ask you to join me in welcoming them all three, to the stage.
Well, I'm happy to be here, happy to join two esteemed artists that I think I speak on behalf of Toronto. We're thrilled that you're both with us tonight. And Rashid is no stranger to Toronto, has been coming here over the past few years with some frequency. And Eric, I think, is just getting a feel for this place. So it's, I think it's great that, as we just heard, community and art community can come together and collaborate, sort of capitalize on circumstance, and I think bring new and maybe unexpected insight to great exhibition opportunities. So I'm cast in the role of moderator. I was watching some debates recently on television. It seems like they're always campaigning in the United States. And just thinking, what does a moderator do if not just sort of set the stage? So I have really just prepared a few topics. This is totally unrehearsed, as it should be. And I thought we might work through them, and you are both eloquent. We'll speak for a while, and then certainly involve all of you and have a dialogue, I hope. So my first topic has to do with camaraderie and kinship. And I heard, that Eric first knew about Rashid's work when Eric, who's 10 years younger than Rashid, was applying to college. He was in high school still, and he, around 2005, already knew about Rashid Johnson's work and felt that he brought a fresh perspective on the Black arts movement through his work. And I subsequently found out that Rashid actually acquired a work of Eric's from a gallery exhibition in Los Angeles at Moran. So they each, I think, were aware of each other's work. I think, despite the gap in their years, that they don't just know about each other's work, but they're in the same orbit. And so I maybe wanted, maybe Rashid, you could start, maybe speak about the idea of camaraderie among artists, maybe among a community that might be amorphous, but is very conscious of itself, and I think takes pride, certainly in the 21st century, in knowing who is a participant and who one can have a dialogue with.
It's an interesting question, and it's an interesting place to start. I have this toothpick because I quit smoking 10 months ago. I'm not a cowboy. I mentioned that to someone earlier. So don't mind this tool that I need for my oral fixation. Camaraderie, it really is an interesting place to start. Honestly, in particular, amongst artists in New York, I feel like it's quite small. It's quite a small group, and so many of us know each other. You can even make that community even more small when you talk about artists of color. And when I was starting as an artist, as a young artist, I felt in a lot of ways like quite embraced by artists who were working alongside me. I was part of an exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2001 called Freestyle, and that was a real introduction to me. I was the youngest artist in the show. I think at the time I was 21 or 22 years old, and Thelma Golden chose to include me. I was a young artist in Chicago at the time, and I came to New York, and in that exhibition, there were several artists like Mark Bradford, Julie Mararetu, Sanford Biggers, Eric Wesley, really a laundry list of artists who I think today are really kind of the foundation for what we're seeing amongst contemporary art of artists of color, who were there and all just really, really present for one another. And so when I got to a different stage in my career, looking at artists like Eric, it was important for me to say, okay, I'm going to acquire work of these artists because I've had so much agency and so much opportunity. And I'd been kind of rewarded for so much of what I had done that I wanted to look at artists like Eric and say, like, how do I contribute to this artist? And I thought the most significant contribution I could make in a way of reaching out and saying, like, I see you and hear you and I understand what it is you're going through and what you're doing, is to say, I'm willing to live with one of these things in my home. And although Eric and I didn't meet necessarily when I acquired the work, that was my way of saying, I see you, and you should continue to do this shit at whatever cost, right?
And we might meet, right? Potentially.
Yeah. And,
Maybe in Toronto.
Right, exactly. I might ask for the work back.
Yeah, right. You have asked for the work back, actually. And it is currently going to be on exhibit here with your exhibition. I'm hoping that they ship it back to me because I did pay for it. So all that said, there's a lot of ways that community is developed. And sometimes it's by being present for one another, in the same space with one another, in dialogue, like a lot of people who, we probably knew who were professors, like Stanley Whitney or Terry Atkins, and people who like really kind of nurtured a lot of younger artists through different stages. And then there were folks who, are playing different roles and contributing in different ways, like me looking at David Hammond. I never had to meet David. David told me every fucking thing I needed to know by looking at the work, and his generosity and his ambition were things that I looked to and continue to look to. And then, of course, the artists who I consider to be of my generation, a little bit above and a little bit below, who have always been really present to, send a text, say, I see what you're doing, I appreciate what you're doing. And it's not all just studio visits and coffee shop, and it's not all Cedar Tavern, beer bong functions necessarily. But it's a community nonetheless. It's been my feeling.
Over to you, Eric.
What about
Yep. I don't know, just the topic is camaraderie and kinship.
Yeah.
And I was quite struck, you mentioned that Rashid had acquired a work of yours, and that kind of resonated with me, and that you would have found out about that, who that work was going to, and I just thought it was maybe a metaphor for your work not just evolving in a vacuum.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I really, first of all, it's nice to do that here, I really, there's meaning in that gesture for sure. That was my first that was my first solo show, period. So, to have that kind of affirmation meant the most to me. I don't know, there's about, there is that connection that will be there, and I think for that show, outside of the collector base, which is also this other kind of network, but amongst artists and, I think there's another work that, from that show that was purchased by Bryce Martin. And that was another point where I was just like, these are major thumbs up. And people that, their careers are monumental and historical, and And that's absolutely the kind of model, that I see myself coming after, so.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't know that about Bryce. Reminds me that Robert Irwin said to me that artists make art history, not art historians. Mm-hmm. Always struck with me, and I think it's incredibly accurate. So my next topic is pretty simple. It's called painting. And, it might solicit chuckles from the audience, but the reality is painting is undeniable. Even if one is denying it, one has to address it, I would say, and in relation to both of your practices. And maybe, Eric, it's interesting for you to speak about your work with fabrics, with textiles, with color, and at the exhibition, the installation, which takes form in the space. The space is scrap metal, and I think what I saw yesterday, you've really masterfully navigated the space, but maybe you can just talk about not painting with a brush, not painting with canvas, not using a stretcher or a conventional stretcher, but suspending color in space and how you think about painting and then how you move beyond painting.
Yeah, for me, painting has been like a space, always a space of questioning, a kind of, first and foremost, the painting as, it's been most important for me to emphasize the painting as an object at first, and separate from like mere surface or picture, but that there's an objecthood to the way that the work is made, a painting object is made, and down to the way it's related to the stretcher bar and related to the wood that the stretcher bar is made out of, and slowly in my development, I've been kind of creating these surrogates for that kind of suspension that I feel like speaks closer to the material of the painting object. And I mean, at this point, it's less, those kind of distinctions are less nameable, and they very much I think are wrapped up in the language of the materiality. But for me, painting is almost like a political distinction. It can be kind of a conservative one, but depending on the context, it can radicalize a lot of the concerns and thinking about making active ideas of color and texture and line and kind of introducing them into the world, and not a mediated, not a clear mediation of distinctions of art and aesthetics, but things that are quite tangible and owned by everyone.
Dirty words, painting. No, I mean it's an interesting thing in that I went to school in the 90s, and painting was not a popular medium when I started as an artist. It was everything was really revolving around photography, new media, installation, performance, sculpture. And when I went to school, all of the really smart kids were doing those things. And the other kids, I won't say what they were painting. And so, it was an interesting time, right? So my mother's an academic. I come from that kind of background. I had a significant interest in philosophy, history, art history, engaging in kind of critical discourse and the critical discourse of our time. as far as kind of medium specificity are really the lack there of medium specificity. Rosalind Krauss wrote a book called Painting on the, or there's like life, something on the North Side, Art in the Age of the Post-Medium Condition. And that's the condition to which I kind of grew up as an artist, which meant that you had no medium specificity. Like Tuesday, you were going to do a performance. Wednesday, you were going to make a video. Thursday, you were going to do something with mark making that you did not call painting. And Friday, you were going to, kind of conjure all of those things into some form of an installation. And so that's where the sophisticated characters were. And that's where I saw myself. That's where I wanted to be. I wanted to be where Karl Marx was relevant, where Derrida was relevant, where Foucault was relevant, where we could discuss kind of modern times, kind of mediated through critical narratives and Simone de Beauvoir. And so as I kind of grew as an artist, right, and as some of those kind of expectations of the avoidance of aesthetics started to wear off of me, I had to kind of think to myself, what is it that honestly makes me get up, go to the studio, want to practice? Is it exclusively, this research and this expectation to play in this kind of rigorous playground of intellectual exploration, or is it a hybrid of that space and what my aesthetic interests are, and what and how I imagine my body moving in space, how I mark things, how I make decisions. And the most fascinating thing about being an artist, to be completely honest, for me, is all of the decisions, right? I mean, this is the reason that we need to fund arts education in school as early as possible, because you do get to make a tremendous amount of decisions as an artist. And when you begin to develop a sense of who you are through those decisions, and a kind of concretism and how you understand the world, right? How you understand curves, how you understand color. I think that really translates into how you navigate the world and how you make decisions in other spaces. And so, those decisions I realized were not simple ones, and that they had their own kind of conceptual gravity. And so, for me at that time, I started to kind of develop some sort of kind of mix between my intellectual ambitions, my critical ambitions, and my ambitions to make objects and things and participate with those things in ways that I thought were poetic and interesting. And if those things are paintings, it's fascinating. Eric calls himself a painter because I avoid that term, more or less, and that's probably generational. Because by the time Eric is coming up, like, painting's okay again, right? Like all the Europeans are back. Everyone likes Lou Toymans. I mean, it's like, there's all this kind of like German, like Kippenberger has like saved the world. And but my generation, I'm like, oh no, I'm a post-medium art. Like if when my mom's friends ask me what I do, kind of thing, which is what you really understand what an artist thinks of himself. When their mother's friends say, like, what do you do? And you have to come up with the most, like, kind of accessible answer. And mine isn't that I'm a painter. It's, it's funny. I think I think I say that I make sculptures. I think that's my getaway, more or less.
Rather than say you're a post-medium artist?
Yeah, that would be hard.
Yeah, I bet. All right, one just snippet, minor detour. Clifford Still, 1951-52, the 3 by 4 meter black canvas in the Art Institute of Chicago. I would think you know it.
Yeah, I almost destroyed that painting when I was, I think, like 12 or 13 years old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just checking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I bumped into that painting. It was my first real experience with a significant artwork. But I was really blown away by that picture. You know, the thing that was really most interesting about that picture to me, and you guys are probably unfamiliar with this painting. It lives at the Art Institute Chicago. It's quite a large Clifford Still painting. It's mostly quite dark, but on the very corner or edge of it, there's this kind of like light brown that still starts to fill in that edge. And the docent who was giving us a tour told us that was Clifford Still's optimism, that Still was bringing light into the corner of the painting, and that the world still had lightness in it. And then I got a little older, and I was like, holy shit, never listen to docents.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what are these people doing? They're just making up shit.
Theater.
More or less.
Live theater. Yeah. That's good. Any thoughts on Clifford Still before we leave painting?
I love him. He's great.
Collage is the next topic, sort of related to painting and maybe the unmaking of painting at a certain moment in early modernism. If you think of Picasso and Braque and the introduction of collage, at least into the European mainstream tradition. But then it's many uses. Ellsworth Kelly, I think an artist that you are close with, Eric, someone who foundationally worked with collage in the late 40s, early 50s, as he was charting his path. And also the way you make your work, which I think some of the ingredients in your Toronto show came from a textile shop at the corner of Dundas and Spadina, for example. And I like the fact that you can come to a place and integrate elements from that place. So, you know, maybe just share some thoughts about collage.
Yeah. For me, I feel like collage is really tied to the index. There being like a kind of diversity and selection and texture to kind of ground difference. But the means in which these things are kind of negotiate space, negotiate edges. Those are kind of the ways in which the difference is able to like kind of allow for, like there's context in that, there's legibility in that, in the edges. Like, I guess, my work, I mean, I've been using the sewing machine more and more. Mm-hmm. And that kind of gesture is, I feel like, a uniting fragments. And it still feels like collage, but it ends up being so specific to this language of, at some points it could feel like quilting, at other points it could feel like I'm assembling a garment. Mm-hmm. Repairing, pants, all of those kinds of gestures, have its own kind of use, but I guess, collage.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, I think the way disparate elements of fabric are joined or sewn or stitched by hand, that one thinks about that, but then you can walk behind. There's a transparency that you can see through the materials, and so it's in a way unlike collage, because collage is sort of opaque and additive, pasted on, and your work is almost like a completely translucent or diaphanous collage in some respect. But I just wondered even if you thought of your work in terms of collage. Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the works fit in as like fabric collages. Mm-hmm. Or that's what I call them.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that fits for some of the work, absolutely. Because I think that the discord ends up being really important, and I think that there's that's where the space of kind of poetics can come in.
I see collage in your work. I do. Collage is a complicated thing because I think it's very difficult to define exactly what it is, right? I had a great conversation once. I was making works that I'm still working towards right now that I call escape collages, which are like intentionally like called collages. The title was that they were collages. And a friend of mine, an artist named Robert Longo, came to me, saw them, we're sitting in my studio, and he said, "These aren't collages." And I was like, "Why would you say that?" He's like, "They're collisions," you know? And the fact that we could, you know, so simply kind of like just change the terminology, right? And start saying, "Oh, well, this is a collage and this is a collision." You know, and essentially, I guess what he was saying was that the intention of collage is to bring in disparate images, ideas, materials, etc., and allow them to integrate with one another to become something autonomous, right? Something in their own through the connectivity. But collisions are different, right? It's to allow those disparate ideas, concepts, materials, images, etc., to share the same space, share the same landscape, share the same surface, whatever that may be, but to be able to sing their own songs, right? And that you know becomes kind of a different thing. So like in your work, I both see collage and collision. I see that you know you like this idea of integration, and the marriages that you create I think are quite significant and quite poetic. But I think you're not married to making these seamless transitions necessarily either, that you're open to a collision happening.
Yeah,
and that's the dichotomy that I think, you know, calls into question like what is a collage at that point.
Yeah.
And just, you know, Rashid, I'm thinking about your use of the shelf and your positing of objects on that shelf, a record, like a vinyl LP with the content of its cover, or a book or some other objects. And it's almost as if it's like a collage in 3 dimensions, because when one thinks of collage, there's the Picasso kind of originary still life with chair caning, the bringing of the seat of a chair into the picture plane as that material, that object previously existing in the real world, or you know the Matisse cut, or the Rauschenberg overlay. Both of you, I think, take some aspect of collage, Romare Bearden, and propel it into the 21st century. And in ultra flat ways, in a sense, seamlessly sewn, or super dimensional ways, almost like pronouncing or accenting the object.
I think you could even take it beyond the idea of kind of 3-dimension, because when you think about the projection of concept onto an object as well, right? So then you're like kind of engaging with it in so many different ways. Like, what was the intention of the artist, or what and how does this material, or the signifier, and in the case of things that I've used in the past, something like shea butter, functions as an object. It's employable as something that you would put on your body. It comes from a certain place. It's West African. So then it's like this, it's becoming kind of like, it's a global material, kind of all conjured in and married, creating narratives with other materials that it's collaborating with, right? So like, is this become a global collage? Is this a cultural collage? Is it a conceptual collage? And I think there are films that we can look at as being collage-like in the way that they kind of conceptually and critically like kind of marry different proposals, different ideas. And so really midgeting the idea of collage into, you know, the flat work, or like within the Western tradition of how we understand it. Romare Bearden being an example, is is limiting what's possible with it. So I like the idea that the word can become expansive in that way, and that was my interest in employing it in works that I've used in the past.
I mean, I also like to think about, I mean, there's collage, but then there's also like, I think the construction of garments can also kind of have a similar fragmented, you know, origin. But the fact that their unification signifies a kind of use ends up being this like very perplexing thing. Like, and simply because of the way that something is compositionally structured, it possesses a particular use. Like, what if an extra arm would be added to your blazer? You know, how would that kind of negotiate a kind of collision or become,
Or call into question utility, right? It's
exactly.
like, can this object be used?
Right,
and
right.
for what purpose and why? You know,
Right.
and for whom?
And just like pictorially, that those things like would be either grounded in a use or not. You know. Yeah.
Great. Next topic is titles. How you title your work and the role that titles play. Eric, one of the works in the recent Whitney Biennial, the title is Proposition: For G's Bend Quilts to Replace the American Flag Permanently. Quite a long and suggestive title versus, let's say, the title of the exhibition here in Toronto, which is just 2 words, Die Lens. Provocative in a different way. So I wonder if you could just share some insight about your thinking around titling.
Yeah, I mean, I guess titling for me is like its own process unto itself. It's like coming from journaling and, you know, just like really thinking about what the intentions around the work really are, or how they could signify for a viewer, how they could be, you know, like hold a particular kind of resonance for, or homage, or like I love that there would be this like variety of possibilities whenever I title a work. You know, and it just, yeah. So the work in the Whitney, I was really thinking about like the kind of communication I wanted around that work, and how the kind of craft I wanted to be I wanted it to be celebrated in the work. Just these active fragments and the kind of articulation in the composition itself. So I see it as like a kind of, in part, homage to the G. Benz quilters. Also, like thinking about like my mind like wrapping around like what an artwork that would be inherently Southern would look like, or what it would feel like. But you know, to add a condition to that would create its own fiction that would be bound to the work itself. So yeah, the thinking about it wet, or that it would be dipped in water, because these are quilts that are filled with object and, you know, filled with history and meaning. So I don't know, yeah.
Great. Rashid, I thought I might just read a few titles of catalogs of yours that I think are specific only to the publications, but never to a work, if my own reading is accurate. Sharpening My Oyster Knife from Bielefeld. Shelter. Message to Our Folks, the catalog from MCA Chicago, which might be my favorite. Magic numbers, blocks, the rainbow sign.
Yeah, I have a complicated relationship with titling things. My first New York solo show at Nicole Clagsburn Gallery at a gallery was titled "The Dead Lecturer," which was a book of poems written by Leroy Jones. Many of us know him now as Amiri Baraka, but he wrote this book as Leroy Jones. My mother used to read these poems to me when I was a young boy. I always say Leroy Jones will never die. Amiri Baraka died. There's a gravestone for Amiri Baraka. Leroy Jones, no gravestone. He'll live forever, which is to me a fascinating concept in its own. But it's meant to lead you into the story. Earlier in my career, I would use titles more as a vehicle. Like when I was younger, I made a portrait of myself with my hair parted pretty aggressively on a corner, and I called it "Portrait with My Hair Parted Like Frederick Douglass." And it was leading you to the source material. It was leading you to how I got there. And I wanted to give you these breadcrumbs. And then sometimes there were things that were a tad more absurd. New Negro Escapist Social Athletic Club Summer Tennis Tournament. And it'd be a self-portrait of me in tennis gear. As the Black Jimmy Connors, actually, is what I called that. I made a film early. It was called United B-Boy Baptist Beat House Crew. And so I was kind of trying to give these breadcrumbs, what was I thinking about? How was I thinking about them? More recently, I guess it's still almost breadcrumb based, but I'm trying to deliver almost more quickly on what I'm thinking about. So the exhibition that I have here in Toronto is titled Anxious Men. And the work, or it's titled Anxious Audience, I'm sorry. And the works that you see on view are of the same title, Anxious Audience. And you come to them, and they are ideally what I said they are, is a group of anxious characters. And I want to just give you a lift as you start the journey of reading an artwork. Because I think essentially what we do more often than not when we're doing it right is that we read an artwork. And I think one of the things that, again, to go back to early education, which has been a thing for me recently, so I'm sorry if I'm preaching, but I think we need to do a better job of teaching visual literacy. We teach kids to read, we teach kids how to do math. But if we were to say, listen, let's figure out together how to read paintings, right? How to read sculptures, right? To have a literacy visually, then I think we would just feel more agency, and we would have more people coming to museums to participate with artworks, et cetera. So, being that I consider that when you look at an artwork, part of what you're doing is reading it. If the title can just give you a start to what we're going to be doing during the course of bearing witness to that artwork, and I say that really specifically, that being a witness to an artwork is different than being a viewer to one. We have expectations for witnesses. Witnesses are supposed to be able to tell us what they saw, right? If the police come to you and you witnessed something, you're supposed to be able to say what it was to some degree that you witnessed. So as viewers and as patrons and as active members of a cultural community, we have to bear witness to artworks, right? And this kind of expands a little bit on what we were talking about around title, but I think that I, again, have considered titles as the launching pad to this kind of literacy piece. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I like it. I think it's important and should be something broadly focused on. I'm switching the order, and I want to sort of continue in that direction and just think about this moment, where we are in history right now as the decade is about to change with the approach of the new year, and maybe hear how you think about your your work in the world. And, I don't think art can change the world, but I think it can definitely play an active and maybe even an activist role in society. And not to be, too lofty or presumptive, but maybe just to think about it functioning in the wider world, let's say beyond the art world, and not just the role of the object, but maybe the role of the artist.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of what I experience in the studio that I think it's about like kind of capturing a kind of beauty, and how to pivot that beauty, like to allow for things that would maybe normally be seen as fleeting, to be able to contain those things, things that like maybe would be normally seen as like maybe fragile, for them to kind of have a place of contemplation. I think there's something really important and powerful about those things, being like kind of included in like a kind of wider conversation of culture, like outside of the museum spaces and outside of the gallery spaces. And how can these experiences of aesthetic beauty, how can they be taught for them to be accessible? But how can they, like how can this poetic be kind of shared in a larger form? I mean, these are questions that I have, and I know that they're not just questions to me, but to my generation, my community.
I mean, I suppose you recently had an experience in the desert of California with your work in a completely non-art context.
Right.
I don't know if you want to briefly elaborate on the trajectory, let's say, of that work.
Well, I mean, that was an amazing project and it was pretty much absolutely ideal in some way, and also like kind of fatal in the other way. Mm-hmm. But the work was a fabric collage that was used a canopy of an abandoned gas station in the Coachella Valley, and as a kind of structure for this like flourish that extended using the gas station, and we were like really lucky enough to like work with Masoni to use like this archive of knits, and they sent them over. I like made the selection on a PDF, and they sent them over. We like stitched them into this amazing collage, and the piece was called Halter, because it, in some way for me, like I wanted people to think about the assemblage not in a fragmented state, but as the possibility of it like in its entirety, like relating to a garment for the gas station, and as an extension of like the architecture. But like kind of a month after the work was assembled, I got a phone call saying that it was burned. So someone like, I think it was like 90% like burned, somebody did. And we never found out who, or like what the circumstances were with it, but the remnants were like on the ground, and
Okay.
How did that affect you? Was that I imagine that was upsetting.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was. The fact that I had to continue to work. I think it made. I mean, okay, I thought it was a really, really violent gesture. There's so many of those times where, like, especially as a young artist, you feel very tied to the objects you make as like more than just a representation of you in a sense. And the scale of that work was the largest that I've ever made, and that, I mean, yeah, it was just kind of violent, and I've been trying to like kind of manage that.
Did you think about, I'm sure you're familiar with a work of David Hammond's called How You Like Me Now, where he installed it in Philadelphia, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a painting of Jesse Jackson, but in whiteface. And after it was installed, it was attacked by several men with sledgehammers. And later on, I don't know how long after, David installed the work again, but with sledgehammers all around it, essentially almost like kind of inviting another attack, like making us aware of his awareness of the initial attack, and then kind of saying like, you know, let's have another go or whatever. And I thought always that was like such a bold way to respond to aggression towards his practice, and such a confident kind of reaction.
Yeah. I love that work. I mean, I felt like I really wanted that gesture to be really separate from the meaning of the work. And
Absolutely.
There's also like this, thing you run into, like, I think, especially really early on in your career, where people end up trying to like finish your work for you or something. Like, I didn't ask you to do this. Or, the really shifting and contextualizing the lasting gesture of the work. And I think that I still have like remnants of the piece, and the Masoni family was really generous to, be collaborators on the project. And I think there's a part of how I want to format the response. It seems to be just about continue with the trajectory of the work in like a kind of pure sense. I think maybe in time, maybe a very long time, that piece will come. And but not if it doesn't feel right, Yeah. Not if it doesn't feel attuned to, just attuned to the moment.
No, I absolutely understand.
Remember the topic?
More or less.
You
suggested that art could not save the world.
I just have one last one. No, I know, but I mean, just about just where we are in history is the beginning of the thought as the decade ends. I mean, there are brackets, and obviously, well, as an artist, I think you do have a consciousness of where we are, and we often look to art as an orientation point. So I just wondered if you had an idea.
No, it's interesting to be contrarian to a lot of what people suggest around a time like this. I don't necessarily see a tremendous amount of fertility in darkness. I'm not a believer that shit goes bad and that art gets good because of it. I think that shit is bad right now. I think that we're living in an incredibly complicated time. I don't care which side of which aisle you stand. We have a lot of work to do collectively to repair some of the damages that have come as a result of these fractures. And when we look to art to be our guiding light at those times, I think that we're making mistakes. I think art is capable of, in its best, reflecting those times. And it's my goal with an exhibition like the one that I'm putting together at the power plant to be a reflection of this time. It doesn't produce an agenda for you to feel particularly satisfied, because I'm not conjuring solutions, nor do I think it's the artist's job to do so. I think that we're witnesses, that we're patiently living here with the rest of you while we experience what it is I feel like we are currently experiencing. I think art that reacts quickly to moments like this tends to be quite didactic, and more often than not, it lacks the kind of rigorous and thoughtful investigation that artists will tell about this time maybe 10 years from now, ideally, and that's suggesting that we're in a better place than we currently are. All that said, I am an optimistic person, and I do think that art has the ability to, even if it's just kind of take small steps. I think artists, in my experience, having not, and in this scenario, I'm not necessarily talking about my own practice, but in my experience, going to museums, going to see what my heroes made in response to complicated moments, having bared witness to complicated moments and then responding after the fact. I've learned a tremendous amount from those practitioners, and they've changed the way that I see the world. And I think art is a great way to change the way that you see the world. Whether that means that changes the world or not, you have to ask yourself, if you change the way you see the world, do you think the world will be different? I'm guessing probably. And so I think it's undeniable that art can change the way we see and the way that we understand. And ideally that's for the best. But yeah, it's
great. I like that. So just my last placeholder here, when I was thinking about how to make a link or just begin a dialogue between you, thinking about your work, I thought of Sun Ra, the great experimental jazz musician.
my hero.
Okay, so not too far off. Also, I think an essential figure in many ways, intergalactic space traveler, but also an incredible costumer. And I was thinking about his essential regalia. And so there are many points of contact that I might have surmised thinking about this dialogue. And so I'd like to read a brief passage from a Leroy Jones book, Black Music, which is the 1968 follow-up to Blues People, both really significant studies about African American music and the role of music. But this is about Sun Ra, and I'll just read this and maybe you can respond, and then we can open it up for dialogue with the audience. Sun Ra wants a music that will reflect a life sense lost in the West, a music full of Africa. The band produces an environment with their music, most of all, but also with their dress, gold cloth of velvet, headbands and hats, shining tunics. The lights go out on some tunes, and the only lights are flashing off of a band on Sun Ra's head, or from altoist Marshall Allen or some of the other sidemen. On one piece, the orchestra moves behind Sun Ra in a long line through the dark, chanting and playing with the lights flashing on and off. A totally different epoch is conjured.
One man will never die, the other one's from Mars. I mean, what more response can one have to that, to that level of brilliance?
It's pretty good.
Should we go to these ones?
Let's do it.
That sounds, yeah.
All right.
Sorry.
I mean, performative, regalia, sounds no one has ever heard before. Citizen of the Deep South, located in Philadelphia. Idea of an orchestra that is an ark, a sunship, a traveling enterprise that brings the audience on board, transporting people through time and epochs, crossing oceans, but really, as you say, jumping from planet to planet. So look that up if you're not familiar with it. But how does this work? People can just ask away, I would say.
I see a gentleman back there.
This working? Yep. If the era of painting is back, and if part of the reason you were in new media was because you were thinking about Derrida and philosophers in a way that arguably today we don't need to think about them because or we think about them less because, as somebody recently put, both about sort of Handmaid's Tale and in 1984, our world is getting back to some of the realities that they were describing. We can look out the window instead of having to read it in a book. What's the form of media that sort of will be of this generation?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't know necessarily. One, I want to say, painting never went away. It's just that dumb people were making it for a few years. It was still present. But, listen, I think, the internet and digital space, like, I sound like a grandfather. Like, you have to remember, I'm a Luddite, more or less. Like, I was the last person to email. I consider myself to be, like, fairly young, but I don't know anything about technology. So any language that I would apply to this is going to make me sound quite ignorant. But whatever that technology space is with the internet and the computers, I think that's going to have something to do with how we imagine media and art pushing forward and accessing new audiences, et cetera. I think that's the most kind of significant medium birth that we have, and I imagine that we're going to see a tremendous amount of exploration, and already seeing artists playing in that space, both in the virtual realm and even flat digital media.
I mean, for me, I just feel like the center of most of these, most of the mediums, in thinking about architecture to fashion design to, I think painting is centered to all of these things as a fundamental way of thinking. So it makes sense that people would go back to the drawing board, so to speak, and to kind of look, pare down and look at the basic tools, to see how we can, how technology can inform, the next movement. But I think it makes so much sense that painting is back, so to speak. I mean, and that's not necessarily the reason why I found it necessarily because it was back, but it just, for me, it was a contrarian move, and felt like, I mean, in the same way, yeah, I just really related to what you were saying, yeah.
Maybe, just as a segue, while the mic makes its rounds, I wanted, could not have Sam Gilliam's name not be brought up tonight, just in terms of, I think, an artist central, maybe in different ways, to each of you. Rashid, you're photographed, I think, quite intentionally in the promotional material for your power plant show with a mid-60s Gilliam detail over your shoulder. And Eric, when you think of Gilliam, in a way, the end of modern painting in America is the move that Gilliam makes when he takes the canvas off the stretcher. It's sort of like Pollock's drip, Gilliam's drape. Absolutely. Everything else happens in between that.
100%.
And so maybe just you could talk about the importance of Gilliam, because I think he's too important not to bring up.
I think you really nailed it by talking about that gesture of Sam's, by removing the painting from the traditional stretchers. That, like, what I often refer to as a kind of a manumission, or kind of the freeing of the canvas, which I think is a great way to think about how he employs kind of signifiers and metaphors in his work, whether he chooses to embrace those things or not. These are arguments that Sam and I consistently have, and I'm comfortable having them with him, is his embrace of color and his embrace of radical gesture marrying itself to the radical kind of gestures of the time, whether that's Sam, who's a painter who's painting in Washington, D.C., whose studio is, blocks away from Martin Luther King marching on Washington. Sam goes out and marches. He comes back to his studio, and he's making really, really radical gestures in his studio. And I think that there's a relationship between those sensibilities and those senses of radicality. Sam is an artist who I think, although at earlier stages was really well respected and well thought of and well collected by almost every major American institution. At some, through the course of his career, and it's no light bit that he was an African American abstractionist, was kind of left to fend for himself. And a lot of curators weren't necessarily digging up the Gilliams that they had, mind you, in their collections at major institutions. And, seeing over the last few years Sam's work being kind of brought back into the fold, and his influence, which I know is significant on Eric, because he and I have talked about this, significant on me, and significant on all of Western painting, to be completely honest, has been really an amazing thing to be able to witness. I think it is created an environment where people are excited to continue to find artists that they believe were overlooked, some of whom were, others who probably should have stayed buried. But these things come with these kind of reimaginings. And I think we're living in a time where we're really doing a deep dive and a deep and important exploration of what it was we missed when we were just sitting there. It was quite a simple thing for us to all sit here and say, because there was a time where the only job of taste-making was which white male artist was making the most interesting thing. Now that we're living in a time where we have to ask ourselves, which woman, which white male artist, which black male artist, which LGBTQ person, which non-gender specific we're all in this pot, right? And we're all kind of being given more opportunity. Now, some people would argue that we have not necessarily reached a space where equality is really deeply present. I would argue that a place like the Power Plant is doing an incredible job of programming and being inclusive. But when we're faced with all of these different kind of characters to interpret, we are now like, what is the aesthetic plan here, right? Like, what are the goals? Like, what are the cultural sensibilities, signifiers? We're now forced to ask, what is Western art, right? Now that the canon has expanded and become more inclusive and people have more agency in it. What are the aesthetic principles? What are the goals? What are the signifiers? And what are the criteria? And I think that is we're living in a fascinating time as we restructure what those criteria are. And Gilliam is a massive contributor to that whole narrative.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I experienced Sam like in Washington D.C. at his show at the Corcoran. I feel like I was in high school, but I mean, it was the epiphany that I like kept with me throughout my time in school, and only till like sometime after grad school that I like really fully decided to try to make the leap off the stretcher bar and into the space to like really think about the kind of choreography and dealing with the space of the viewer. And I remember that show so vividly, just as the play within the architecture, those huge canvases, like kind of structured by the paint itself, you know, not like dealing with like the kind of priming and like separating to the kind of priming that would construct a picture, but really, you know, there's a real material truth when you think about his work. Between a few years, there was a Morris Lewis show as well at the Hirshhorn, maybe a few years after that. But like for me, the way that Sam kind of, you know, allowed the painting object to be with you, really felt like very politically charged. Just in the space of like it as a presence, almost like, you know, in a more physical way than just the flatness. But yeah, I mean, I still, yeah, I only got a chance to meet him, I think in the winter time. That was the first time he and I met, but yeah, he's monumental to me, yeah.
Huge.
Hi, this is for you, Eric. I went down in June to New York to see the biennial, and I was quite moved by your other piece, Easter Spring Holy Ground. You use a press release from Alvin Baltrop's show, and I went with a dear friend of mine, and we went outside of the Whitney, we went to the pier, and there's like a mini golf putting thing that's going to be built there or something, but we wanted to see where the site of where he was photographing, because there were some, just from what I remember, some long views of where Alvin was shooting. And I wanted to specifically ask you, I didn't get to ask you this the other night, but particularly about erasure, because you bring up a history that, you know, that whole side of the meatpacking district was, if anybody remembers it, when there was like a lot of BDSM kink culture down there. Not that I have participated, but from my own, I'm not coming out here or anything with that, but you know, you brought up a very important time period for queer culture and queer history. And then it's World Pride, and it's Stonewall 50. And I really felt that the Brooklyn Museum show spoke to your piece quite a bit. It was like, I wish this piece was in that show. But it was in the biennial. And the show I'm referring to was Nobody Promised You Tomorrow.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, which was everybody born after Stonewall. So I would say millennials and like Gen X artists. And I wanted to specifically ask you about how you think about those things, because you're, I guess, a millennial or a zennial, and you are, I don't get the sense that you live on the internet all the time, but what were you thinking about those things around, particularly around erasure?
For me, that piece, so the way that the Baltrop subject matter comes up is through a press release from his show at Daniel Buchholz. And it was a Douglas Crimp had curated the exhibition, and I found out about Alvin Baltrop for the first time from a Douglas Crimp lecture that he gave at Cooper when I was a student. And I mean, I was incredibly moved by the images, and alongside the way that the work was kind of presented, Crimp also acknowledged the fact that the erasure involved in the ways in which his work had been overlooked and not acknowledged, or the fact that there was some really active points of resistance, having to do with his identity and the way that he passed, and I felt like for me, that work is all about a kind of framing device. And the fact that it kind of is, it's kind of glued to the surface of that moving blanket. And I mean, what I really felt that kind of gesture would, or that kind of loaded object would kind of absorb itself into the material of the blanket and kind of change, not just change its meaning, but kind of change its kind of intent. There's also a Melvin Edwards press release, and then there's a number, that work is its own kind of constellation, and serves as a kind of container for these names, for
Melvin
a kind
Edwards,
of meaning. Yeah.
The Whitney press release?
It was from another gallery exhibition. I think it was at Alexander Gray.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think there's a part of that, relationship to, selection and, the fact that I went to see these shows and they were very impactful to me. And when you do see those kinds of things, I mean, what can you collect if you can't, buy a work? You take a press release and you kind of acknowledge its impact. You buy a catalog, and the way that press release, well, that was the only press release that hadn't got kind of transformed by the dye that was used. And it's incredibly legible, and I think mostly because I felt like this story was so tied to New York, and that it needed to be presented amongst this kind of abstract fragmentation for it to be located. I thought that at the very least that was something that a way that the work could function. Thank you.
suppose I'll ask a question. So David, you mentioned this idea, this quote from someone, an artist, can't recall right now, that artists make art history, and it sort of reminds me of Barney Newman's, aesthetics is to artists as ornithology is to the birds. So, but I wonder, in this context, talking about painting, and there's always that perpetual, painting is dead, and of course it's never been dead. It always sort of comes back. But then when it comes to aesthetics, I wonder how the two of you feel about sort of this, old school notion of the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime, and how might that relate to your work?
There's something to be said for poetry, and there's something to be said for the sublime. There's something to be said for what we all kind of imagine we could conjure as the beautiful, and that we could all, seemingly agree could be beautiful. But that's a moving target, and has been for many years a moving target. I think it's an interesting thing that we look today at artists like Sal LeWitt and Carl Andre and Donald Judd, and I often hear people describe those works and say, these are beautiful, which is really almost quite sacrilegious to the intention of a lot of these artists' work, right? But that these things have been adopted into the aesthetic canon is kind of evidence that this canon is not stable necessarily. A lot of the kind of iconography that we can look to in early religious painting, maybe we wouldn't necessarily find to be as beautiful today as the beautiful minimalism of Donald Judd's cube, right? So using that as a framework is how I think about my aesthetic sensibility, meaning that although some of the decisions that I may make currently don't necessarily resonate with everyone as being aesthetically valuable, I'm betting that the target will ideally one day move in a direction that allows the things that I make at some point to have aesthetic validation. And I don't have like the ambition to chase a very specific kind of aesthetic set of concerns or criteria. I just think that making decisions is a solution that'll get me to a place that I feel is beautiful.
I mean, I love the idea of, I think poetics is a really important quality that I feel like is something I try to hone in on in the studio. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of burden, in terms of these kinds of expectations for artists to be kind of innovators of new forms of beauty. But I feel like it's something that I end up holding myself responsible for at the end of the day. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I try to draw as much inspiration from the everyday as possible, and the way that I've come to kind of recognize that has to do with thinking about repetition in my days and the things that I notice, the kind of ruptures in my walk to studio, or getting a coffee, or these things that are discarded on the ground that maybe don't have a inherent story to them, but maybe they need to be located in some ways. I think that there's ambition for those things to kind of be better understood and why they kind of captivate. But yeah, I think, you know, it's something worth, it's a kind of practice, you know, that I think I try to kind of dislodge its relationship to the canon or what that looks like, because then you're kind of trying to anticipate some kind of forward movement or something. But yeah.
I think beauty, you know, plays a role in both your works in different ways. We spoke about Ellsworth Kelly or Blinky Palermo, for example, which is a softer and maybe more accessible idea of beauty. And I think, Rashid, in your work, there is a sense of beauty that takes you by surprise, actually.
I'm glad
often.
you struggled with that.
Yeah.
That was really rewarding for me.
You know? But,
In a genuine way, I say this.
well, it is. I'm feeling like we are, though, on many topics, just scratching the surface. Like, we probably should have only done this hour thinking about Sam Gilliam, you know? Because it's like the more I think about that, the more there is to know and explore. And I think, anyways, that must be a criterion for what we refer to as great art. So maybe I would just say this. I think you'll be around for the next little while. You're both in Toronto for this week. Eric's show opening Thursday night at Scrap Metal. Rashid here at the power plant on Friday. So if people want to engage you, I think those opportunities may present themselves. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.